I can just say welcome, everyone. I'm Rosalie Vasquez-Yetter, one of the co-executive directors at Partners Global. For those of you who don't know us, we are a peace-building, democracy-promoting organization over 34 years. We sort of started as a social impact investment model, really looking at what we call peace entrepreneurs. So we would cultivate groups of sort of sponsors that were interested in helping support individuals and small informal organizations in countries where there was a current conflict or post-conflict situation, and helping them sort of gather together and kind of build the foundational aspects of an organization, helping them to sort of cultivate networks, and then building out a network of these independent centers. And right now we have 20, including ourselves, around the world, working on a lot of topics around peace, development, particularly resilient civic space, the challenges, of closing civic space. And one of the areas that we've really been working on is resiliency in this time of sort of post-truth, post-COVID, and kind of rising authoritarianism. So as many of you who've been involved in attending all of the PeaceCon conversations, in past years we've focused a lot of our energies around sort of narratives for peace, and thinking about how we're looking at colonialized language, and thinking about how we can really work with narratives and depolarize situations and circumstances using this combination of development, inclusivity, and kind of conflict sensitivity. But there's another side of these narratives and the storytelling that we really have encountered in our network, and the response that we have to that is to think, where can we go? Really to get good advice from people who are doing the job of telling narratives and telling stories. And in comes my colleague here on the podium. Amy Costello is an amazing journalist, investigative journalist for many years, and she'll tell you about herself in just a moment. And she's on the front lines, and has been on the front lines, really being inside of conflicts and making sure that we are really being ethical in the way that we are not only interacting with the people that we are speaking with on the ground as peace builders, as journalists, as democracy promoters, but also in the way we think about how to plan any kind of communication efforts that we are doing. And we really felt that in our space in peace building, it's important for us to learn from those who are professionals in this space. So Amy is with us, and she'll present a little bit more about her background. I wanted to also tell you a little bit, I'm going to use my notes here, about one of the presenters whose inputs you're going to see as part of a video that Amy produced.
Screen, and we'll have her name.
Yeah, so I'm going to show you here. That's me. So Odi Lagi is a program director, and she works with NULI, which is the acronym. It represents the network of university legal aid institutions in Nigeria. And NULI is a very beloved partner with Partners Global. We work with them for over 5 years now on a lot of programs that are promoting kind of work in the social justice space, kind of peace and security. And most recently, I want to actually give you the full details, because we're very proud of the work that they've been doing. You know, they have been increasing access to justice, and have done so for over 15,000 pre-trial detainees in Nigeria. And this has been funding from Department of State, INL. We also are working with them to collaborate on a particular research project to better understand relationships between civil society, us, and security actors during nonviolent movements. This is also something funded by Department of State. It's a DRL project. So if you don't know NULI, we hope you can get to know them a little bit more after this. We're happy to share more information. So I will pass this over to Amy.
Thank you, Rosalie. Yeah, I'm Amy Costello. I've been a journalist for about 20 years. I was an NPR producer, then I was based in Africa for 5 years, traveling pretty extensively around the continent, producing stories for public radio and public television. Then had a podcast for 10 years called Tiny Spark, which investigated nonprofits, philanthropy, and international development. And now I am segueing over into working directly with nonprofits on what I'm calling ethical storytelling and trauma-informed interviewing and reporting. I think many people working in the nonprofit sector, especially in the peace building space, are frequently working with people who have experienced trauma. And I'm very interested in how we can ethically and safely interview people who have experienced trauma and write about them and tell stories about them in close collaboration with them. So this presentation is kind of a kickoff of that new line of work for me, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you. As this presentation goes on, I have a few kind of points I want to make with this presentation. We will be hearing from Odie. And then I'd love to turn it over to you and have some conversation. So if you have questions, comments, pushback, as the presentation unfolds, please hold your questions, and I'm going to look forward to hearing them and engaging with you after this is done in about 20 minutes or so. Thank you. We are also going to be hearing in this presentation from Sophie Otiende. She is a human rights expert based in Kenya, and I interviewed her on my podcast a few years ago about ethical storytelling. She's an incredibly powerful speaker, and we will be hearing excerpts from her today too. So without further ado, I just want to...
What did we just do?
That's it. That's the slide.
Okay,
and
gotcha.
Rosalie is very kindly
They look so beautiful. I
managing
thought I
the
went to a
slides for you.
screensaver. Okay.
Well, it felt important to me to just recognize that so much of the knowledge that I'm going to be sharing with you today comes from the people that I have interviewed over the past 10 or 15 years. And I'm very grateful for all the knowledge that they've shared with me. And my work and my thoughts today are a reflection of everything that they have taught me. And I just want to recognize their input into this presentation and to express my gratitude for the fact that they've shared their stories with me. So I just want to start with just a few questions for you guys, and if you can just kind of, you don't need to raise your hand, let's just kind of quickly, as I'd say, popcorn. Let's ask the first question. Why does your organization tell stories?
To attract.
And you can speak up a little bit, that'd be
To
great.
attract
To attract what?
individuals.
To do what?
Participate or join them because of their fighting for or they're working for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. Why else does your organization tell stories?
To attract funding.
Mm-hmm.
My first thought was awareness raising.
Yes, yes.
Peacebuilding is inherently very complicated. I think stories are a good way of projecting emotions, ideas. It's a good medium.
Yes, yes. Okay. Next. What would you consider the components of an ethical peacebuilding story? If you kind of looked at a really great, strong story, what would be some components of that ethical story? Yes.
I think in terms of ethicality, that making sure that you're giving them a platform and a voice that isn't exploitative, and that they have a stake in the story that they're telling, the way that is being distributed. To me, that's a huge component to ethical storytelling.
And what would that look like? Like, how would you know that you haven't been exploitative?
Yeah, I think that's hard to do, but I think it also is then, because it's not just up to that person, it's then the person that is deciding to tell that story. So I think that takes internal work within that person as well.
Mhm.
So I think it means doing your own internal work and education, how you're then, especially if you're going to be learning about what your identity and who you are, and then the spaces that you're going into. So I think that there's some work for you to do that, so in order to then not be exploitative, because I don't really want to put that, how do you know that you're not being exploited?
Mhm.
It's on the person telling that story to
Mhm.
make sure that they're doing that work
Mm-hmm.
to make that environment. Because I mean, I think the greatest stories come when people are feeling safe and empowered, and if you're being exploited, that's obviously not happening.
Right, right. Anyone else have ideas about what an important components of an ethical peace-building story would be? How would you know that it's been successful, that you feel good about it? What's that?
Consent.
Talk about that.
Consent.
What do you mean?
I just went straight to sort of like safeguarding and do no harm, but also informed consent in terms of if there's issues of being children that you're dealing with, or elderly, or folks in a crisis situation that feel like they have to tell something in order to receive something.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to be talking about consent in this talk. Anybody else? Well, let's just get one more component of ethical stories.
I think connection and emotion. When you're
Mm.
connected and emotionally tied with what you're talking about and you're telling about it, more people are passionate about listening and kind of drawing their attention more towards what's happening. And that makes it easily, attract other individuals and you create a bond between.
Yes. Thank you. I think what else go on? So I just want to hear briefly from Odie Lagi, who does work with Partners Global, and I asked her about development and what it means to her when we use the term development. And I'm just going to share a little bit about what she had to say.
Trying to get to the voice here, sorry guys.
The drivers of development will give us a picture entering every space of skyscrapers, of the drivers of development will give us a picture entering every space of skyscrapers, of modern.
Okay, let me just play it off of mine.
Technical difficulties, guys, sorry.
I'm also
So-
noticing that there's some comments in the chat. Perhaps they were talking about
The questions?
the questions. just
Oh,
to-
okay. Is Bridget here?
I'm getting on now.
Oh, okay. We see your questions for those of us joining on Zoom, and we're, I'm sorry we haven't included your participation yet, but we will start to do that very soon. And I'm going to just try to play the audio, and you can
Yeah,
do the
I'll do it
visuals.
as
So
it is. Yeah.
here we go.
The drivers of development will give us a picture entering every space of skyscrapers, of modern buildings as what development means. And then a picture of a child standing by a mud hut in Africa as what underdevelopment and poverty mean, or a picture of somebody walking barefoot
Go.
as The drivers a of picture of development. poverty.
Go.
The drivers. Now, for example, when I was a child in my village, I would love to wear my shorts, no shirts. I run outside, I play with everybody. We go to the streams, we play. We wear only maybe briefs and run around. Take that picture and you go and you will say, oh, these children do not have clothes. No, this is how we love to live.
Go.
The drivers of development, and that is our liberty. And it does not mean that necessarily every picture that looks like that from Africa is a picture of poverty or deprivation.
So I'm sorry for the technical glitches on that, but you know, my aim there is to, and Odie's aim is to show how context is so important with visual images, and that we can, you know, have an image like that and underline it with the joy that she had in that experience of swimming as a child, and that's a joyful image and memory for her, and yet we can frequently in our communications infuse that image with the somber music and the dire picture, and how do we look at these images and what do we infer from them? So go. And so we're gonna, I just want to touch briefly on what many people talk about as deficit-centered narratives versus strengths-based narratives.
And Amy, I'm just going to interrupt really quickly. Were there a couple of questions from that last segment that we have now, Bridget, that you want us to address?
I think maybe these guys can see the question.
I apologize for interrupting, and we do apologize again for the tech. Just to go back and make sure we didn't lose those questions.
Okay, just raise your hand if you want to.
Yeah, if anybody's seeing something on the chat, raise your hand, let us know.
So one way to think about narratives is thinking about whether we are focusing on the deficits in a community or with people that we're talking about and writing about and telling stories about, or whether we're focusing on their strengths. And I think Odie, in her words there, is encouraging us to really think about imagery and reminding us of the importance of context. When we show an image in isolation, people may draw their own conclusions, but it may be up to us to put those images into context. And, you know, Odie was talking about how what she experienced as joyous can simultaneously be depicted as something that's lacking. And if we are raising funds or awareness, is it better to point to what is lacking, or to communicate instead about the world we wish to see? Point to what is working, to point to joy, and how we can build more of it in the communities in which we work. Point to what we want to see more of. And so, as advocates for human rights and for peace building, it's good to think about how we want to, with visuals, portray our work. And there's an image like this, which may represent what we are against and what we may see too often in our day-to-day work in communities around the world. We may frequently see images like this one. But if you chose images that represent what your organization is for and represents and strives for, that can be a very different experience. And so perhaps you want to talk about what, you know, justice can look like, the world that we want to live in. And it's interesting to just look at those images side by side and what they evoke in each of us, and what kind of messages we want to be sending to our donors and to the public as we raise awareness about the issues that we're involved with. I just want to talk very briefly here. There's lots of really good resources out there about kind of asset-based storytelling, solutions-oriented journalism. And there's three that I will point you to now. Travion Shorters is the creator of something called Asset Framing. He's a wonderful speaker and thinker and writer about these topics, and I would encourage you to go to his website and kind of Google him. I think he'll have a lot of really good, a wealth of information for you. There's the Solutions Journalism Network. Solutions journalism is an entire movement, and a lot of people, when they hear that term, they think of fluff reporting, these kind of, you know, nice pieces about some community hero or something like that. No, solutions journalism is rigorously reported stories about things that are working. To the extent that things are not working, they report on that too. They also report on the limitations of this solution. So it's rigorously reported, but is through the lens of solutions. And if you Google them, you'll find that their data shows that this is what readers want to see. The public wants to see where is the hope, what is working and why. And so that's another resource for you. And then there is a whole spectrum of information about hope-based communications or asset-based communications. There's an organization called Open Global Rights that has a guide to hope-based communications, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. So you raised the issue of consent, and that is a critical part of any ethical storytelling process. And when you ask people to be interviewed, I think the idea of consent is one that should be foremost in our minds, because someone may say yes to an interview. Where else is that? Someone may say yes to an interview, but does that mean that you have their full consent? And in the context of peace building and intercultural dynamics, what does consent mean? And can it be freely given? Especially if we're interviewing people who have experienced trauma, for instance. So we are now going to hear from Sophie Otiende. As I said, I interviewed her on my podcast. And as I said, I talked to her about ethical storytelling. And she is an expert on human trafficking, and she shared her concerns about organizations asking those they've helped to share their stories with the public.
If you think about most of the people actually requiring victims to tell their stories are organizations that have assisted them. Think about the power dynamic Think about the fact that this is probably the organization that basically stopped something horrible from happening from them. Think about the power that that organization holds over this victim. And then think about consent. Think about whether that victim, that survivor, would actually be able to give proper consent about telling their stories or about being involved.
So I think this issue around power dynamics and consent is really important for those of us in the nonprofit and peace building space to really consider. If your organization has helped a person in a conflict zone or in any other kind of crisis situation, and you find them to be compelling speakers with an amazing story, and they probably look good on camera and all of those things, you might be inclined to ask them, would you be on the front of our fundraising brochure, on our website? Will you come up on stage at our fundraising gala? Are they going to say no? It's going to be very difficult for them to say no to your invitation. And I think it's, very important to be aware of that and to find ways to see if you can somehow right that power imbalance a little bit and really make sure that when they say yes to your invitation for an interview, that they feel like they fully want to do that and that they fully understand the repercussions and what's involved in sharing their story with the public.
So we do have an online comment.
Great.
From Andrea Chalet. I think it was about the previous
Okay.
Topic
Yeah.
of solutions-based journalism. A challenge is that positive images of peace are frequently rooms of people sitting. Images of dialogue tend to be uninteresting and don't engage emotions.
Interesting. I mean, the more positive image that I showed was a woman protesting, marching. We saw the children swimming. So I would agree. I mean, I think, and I'm not a photojournalist or a photo expert of any kind, so I can't comment too much. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, you don't want to have stagnant imagery, but I think there can be a lot of lively imagery that kind of reflects the causes that we are fighting for and the kind of the reality that we would like to see in the world. But yeah, I think that point is well taken. And I certainly wouldn't recommend people sitting behind desks as a compelling photo. But I think there's lots of room to just kind of interrogate a little bit more what kind of images we're choosing and why, and what those messages send to the public that we're trying to inform and engage with.
Yeah, and if I can, jumping in, just thinking of the choices that Amy had, I think it gets to the questions that are in some of the other sessions that we've heard in the past couple of days around definitions, right? So what is an expression of peace? So in Odie's case, she talked about like the picture of the young, I don't know, we had audio issues, but there are young boys, they're barefooted, they're running, it's in dirt, and they have a soccer ball that's handmade. So what are the assumptions that we're making? She's presenting an opinion that often an assumption would be made that that's poverty and that is young people who are dealing with some sort of injustice. And in her mind, it was that freedom. I think she used the word liberation. And so it really is about like rethinking the imagery of what it means to be liberated, what it means to feel that peace. And it's not just in those rooms of dialogue, what is going on around that dialogue that's taking place that we don't typically think to snap a photo of or talk about.
Thank you. And I just want to say here, it's obviously, there are people who do want to tell their stories and who are eager to speak in public or for awareness raising, but I think just having in the back of your mind these issues of power dynamics is really important. And I think many of us come from organizations that have funders. And when you think of that power dynamic, we all really kind of want to please our funders. Same too with the people that you're helping, they want to please you so that your services keep coming. So there's going to be an inherent bias for them to say yes to your requests, and just being mindful of that. So as I mentioned already, I think in my reporting career, for a number of different reasons, many of the people I've interviewed have experienced hardship or trauma or incredible difficulty in different aspects of their lives. And I think in the peace building arena, this is probably also the case frequently. And sometimes in my experience, even as a journalist, when I was traveling around the African continent, for instance, I would often arrive at organizations, maybe like the ones that you represent, and they would point me to somebody that could speak about the issue that I was reporting on. And inevitably, this person has been interviewed before, and people like me, a white journalist from a Western nation, is coming in, and I'm going to be the 5th or 6th or 12th person who's interviewed, maybe this former child fighter, for instance, or somebody, you know, if it's HIV, or, you know, pick your issue. And I asked Odie about this issue, about our quest to interview people, to have them share their experiences, and I want to share what
For some people, it might not be traumatizing, it might be healing to tell their story. It depends on the person's makeup and how they were brought up. But the question is really about the person coming to interview. If this story has been told before, why do you need to come and seek a story again? Why is your own angle different from the original story that was told? Why can't you write about that story based on the first story that was told? It shouldn't be about going back to re-interview those persons. It should be about asking the question, why have this story been told several times? What have the other storytellers been using the story for, and why is there no change? Who has to take responsibility for that? Those are the questions that we need to ask ourselves.
So I think that's something to keep in mind, is that interviews are extractive. They're an extractive exercise, and I have extracted many things from many people over the course of my career, and I try to be cognizant of that. And whenever I'm going into a situation where there is tension of one kind or another, I'm very aware. I'm often trying to talk to people who are overtaxed already, very busy, and I'm asking for an hour of their time to let me interview them or follow them around. And that is an extractive exercise. I'm asking them for things, and I'm getting value. I'm enriching my story. I'm enriching my career. And what are they getting in return? And as Odie just pointed out, nothing's changing in their lives, but here comes another journalist or organization representative asking to tell their story. And so I just want to be aware too of that dynamic, and I try to be as respectful as much as I can about taking people's time to tell them how their story is going to be used and where, that I cannot promise that their lives will change, nor will the future of this community change, but that I do appreciate them sharing what they know with me. And the other thing I do is to get lots of clarity before I ever interview someone about why I am interviewing them. Can you flip, please? So this is something that I think is really worth thinking about before you or your organization undertakes telling a story or a narrative about a person or community or issue. I think it's really helpful to get a lot of clarity about why you're interviewing this person. And I think it's actually one of the most vital questions that anyone can ask themselves before they ever produce a story, before they ever choose anyone to interview, because it will help, I think, avoid a lot of the potential ethical dilemmas that we're talking about. It can help to avoid an exploitative situation. I have a woman I'm about to interview who's had a very dramatic, perhaps traumatic story, and I want to know, well, why am I interviewing her? Because we're all aware of this issue. Why her and not her? And if I'm going to interview her, why am I doing this? What is the larger context of the issue that I'm reporting on? How is she going to help illuminate this bigger issue? What detail, I kind of know a little bit, I've heard a little bit about her life. What details do I need to include? Which should I omit to avoid an exploitative kind of profile? And yeah, so I think, and I've talked to some others involved in this space, and I think a lot of times if you don't have clarity about why you're telling the story, you can run into all kinds of challenges, and it just kind of streamlines your editorial process to have a lot of clarity about what you're doing before you set out to do it. So I asked Sophie Otiende, who has been the profile of several stories herself, about what that experience was like for her. And this is something that I want all of us to think about as we put together stories, is discussing, directly with them what might be the consequences of sharing their story with the public. Sophie is an expert on human trafficking. She also happens to be a survivor of trafficking herself, and she told me what it was like to share
No
her.
one talks to survivors about the impact of telling your story, what it does to you, what it ultimately means, because we tend to think that we live in an ideal world. When I tell my story, everyone will be moved with compassion. We all know that that's not true. I've spoken in public about my story, and I've gotten people abuse me. People tell me that I'm used goods. I've gotten so many things. I've gotten attention that is not okay. What are the systems we've put in place to protect survivors once they've told their stories? Or once they've told their stories, we completely forget that they exist and then move on to the next conference, to another survivor telling their story.
So this kind of brings us to the notion of post-interview follow-up, and on my podcast I had interviewed a woman who had experienced some severe abuse as a child. Her father was a celebrated humanitarian, and he had committed the abuse. And she finally, as a middle-aged woman, decided to tell her story with the public, and she went to the Oregonian and shared her story. And I interviewed her after that for the podcast, and then about a year later I followed up with her again because I was going to be giving a presentation on ethical storytelling for nonprofits, and I wanted to circle back to her and tell her that I wanted to use some excerpts from her story for this presentation. And I again asked her how she was doing, and she said, before I went to the Oregonian, I wish that I had been given a Miranda rights. And for those who may not be familiar, it's what police in the United States are required to say to everyone that they arrest, that they have the right to remain silent and that kind of thing. But they're given rights and read a list of rights. And, it makes me wonder if we should not have a set of Miranda rights for people we interview, that they don't have to answer every question a journalist asks them, that they can leave an interview if it's too upsetting, that they can change their mind and say, actually, I don't want you to use my story. But I think part of ethical storytelling is trying to equip the people we interview with knowledge about what their rights are in this process, and to be communicating that all along the way. And so to think about it, can your organization think about this also? So we're going to just do this big splashy fundraising campaign. We're going to be, highlighting people from our communities in Guatemala and Malawi that we work with. We're going to be featuring their photos on our website, and maybe to, follow up with them afterwards and see what that experience was like for them, because a lot of people are very proud to have their images splashed all over the internet. Some people have reservations about it. Some people don't feel so good about it. So I think just kind of keeping in mind, what can I do post-publication to take care of or to check in with the people that we've profiled? Sophie Otiende felt a little exposed after some of her media appearances. I've spoken to other people who have too. So that's just one thought I have. And we're about to wrap up here with Odie having the last word. She just shares some larger questions for all of us to consider about the work that we do and what our motivations are for doing the work that we do.
I will ask a question to the audience, and I'm saying everybody should ask themselves what your duty is to what. Is our duty to humanity? Is versus our duty to just the work we do and our best interest in making sure the work is done. Who are we accountable to? Where does our duty lie? And how transparent are we in the things that we do in our practices, in the question that we ask, and how we use the answers that we get? It's not an easy thing, but I leave everybody with those questions. You have to ask it every day of your life. You will not be able to solve the whole problem, but I believe that to the extent we can solve it, we will hand the next generation better tools to keep pushing a more ethical lens in development.
So, yeah, those are my thoughts. And Odie's thoughts and Sophie Otiende's thoughts, both of whom I thank profusely for their knowledge and sharing their thoughts with us. So, did you have anything to add before we go to the audience?
I just think, I hope, excuse me, I hope everyone could hear, and I think we can make the slides available because really the voice is important as well. And I know that, at Partners, we're thinking a lot about this, and it's about how do we transfer this knowledge from the profession, right? And embed that in the way we are interacting with, our counterparts in the work that we do. And this last question Odie puts to us is really asking why, and Amy brought this up to us. We had a small group in our offices yesterday. So we always need to know why we are having the conversation. It's not just, an ad hoc decision to go and extract, and reminding ourselves of the fact that we are being extractive. But you can extract information in a way that is respectful and, that retains someone's dignity. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think we think a lot about extremes in communication in our space, and so that was something that really stuck with me. So thank you.
Do you have questions or thoughts? Yeah.
So we do have a digital participant, and our friend from Zoom is going to help me let him talk from the Center for Global Peace Journalism. So I wanted to hear some of his thoughts on peace journalism, if that's possible.
Great.
So let's see. Thank you, Christian, at Zoom.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Good. So my name is Stephen Youngblood. I'm the director of the Center for Global Peace Journalism at Park University. We work with journalists around the world, so far 43 different countries, on peace journalism projects. And these projects vary in scope depending on where we are. We've certainly done quite a bit of peace journalism and trauma reporting workshops recently in Northern Ireland. In Kosovo, we talked about remembering troubled pasts. And so just a quick minute or two elevator pitch on what peace journalism is in case you're not familiar with it. So peace journalism, by definition, I pasted one definition into the chat. When reporters and editors make choices of what to report and how to report it, that lets society consider nonviolent responses to conflict. A second definition of peace journalism I also just put into the chat, and that's when reporters and editors make choices that improve the prospects for peace. So these choices include how to frame stories, carefully choosing which words are used, and images as well, to create an atmosphere conducive to peace and supportive of peace initiatives and peace builders. Now, in terms of trauma specifically, as I say, done quite a bit of work on peace journalism and trauma. I encourage you to go to the DART Center for Trauma and Reporting, and I've included that in the chat as well. So when peace journalism talks about trauma reporting, it's many of the same excellent things that our presenters talked about context, about consent, about empowering interviewees to say no at the outset and anywhere else along the line. In addition, from peace journalism, we would talk about considering the impact of your reporting. I believe One of the video clips talked about that, about how images can exacerbate an already dire situation or re-victimize those who have been traumatized, about not prematurely jumping on the blame bandwagon or jumping to conclusions. And as the panelists intimated, to not intrude, to be respectful of our interviewees and so on. So that's just a real quick tour of peace journalism vis-a-vis trauma. I'll be here to answer any questions that you have. I've also pasted into the chat, or will paste into the chat, my contact information if anyone's interested in learning a little bit more about peace journalism or looking at our magazine. Thank you much.
Well, thank you very much. It sounds like you're doing very important work, and I'm heartened to hear about it, and I look forward to learning a little bit more about your work. Thank you. Is anybody? Yes.
Hi, this is really great. I definitely learned a lot. My name is Maria. I work at AFP, but when I'm not working at AFP, I'm also a grad student at GW. And my question is really related to how women and children are framed in storytelling, media narratives. And the reason I ask is this semester, I was in one class that the class was being taught by a practitioner in the field of like communications, global strategy, all of that. And we were making like media, like social media, not just social media, but like media campaigns. And she was really stressing that when you want to get your point across, if we're trying to get funding, you know, showcasing like pulling at the heartstrings for women and children. So I'll give an example of what we were talking about is the war in Ukraine.
Can you, I don't know if we got you a microphone, or I just want, I don't know, is this what we
Really
use?
long cord, so
Huh?
it's corded, yeah.
Thanks.
Should I
To make
start
sure
over, or should I just keep going?
Sure. Yeah, I just don't know if the Zoom audience can hear you or not, so I
We
think.
can hear her.
Okay.
Oh, you
great.
can?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna sit down then.
So you can continue. If they could hear you, you can just keep going.
And basically the example in that class was we were discussing like Ukraine and wanting to get more funding and different things. And that professor was saying, you know, talk a lot about the women and children leaving their husbands, the children not going to school, and really playing all of that. And then I was in another class that was a gender war and peace class, so a gender class. And that professor was talking a lot about how too often women and children are only showcased as victims of conflict and different things, and it's a real problem when we're only saying in the story this many women, you know, lost their husbands, this many women had to do this, and then we need to show them as change agents. And it's been really interesting to me because it's two very well-respected professors in the field saying completely opposite things. So I was just curious kind of your takes, what you've seen in your work, just kind of where you land on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and this whole discussion around ethics is like you could bring 10 thoughtful people up here and we'd have 10 different thoughtful responses, you know? And I think for me, it would be about what story I'm trying to tell about this part of the world, right? And I think that gets at the why. And so before I begin to think about those really important issues you just raised, questions you asked, I would want to figure out, as a, you know, and I'm a journalist, so that's all I can, the only place I can speak from, is why am I telling this story? And I would imagine that if I'm going to a region where there's conflict, for instance, I'm not going to just do it'd be unlikely that I would try to just do a broad story about the conflict in this region. I would probably choose an angle to explore. And so maybe it's about the economy 6 years after this conflict broke out. How is the economy doing? I'm making this up, you know. Or what happened to the thriving arts world that used to be here before bombs started, you know, dropping. So something very specific. And then I would try to find some interesting people who were doing some interesting economic, innovative things there. Or, you know, a dancer who lost her siblings but is about to perform next week on stage as a way to honor them. I don't know, I'm making this up, but the point is, you can see how specific I'm getting. And then once I've figured out why am I here, what am I doing, what kind of story am I telling, finding people who can, and so then when I go to interview that dancer, I'm very aware of why I'm interviewing her and what I want to ask her about. or the woman who started up a business 2 months ago and is actually earning a little more than she ever did. Oh, that's interesting. How did she do that? And you can also see how I'm getting a little bit solutions oriented. I'm talking about, what's working here. And there's plenty of stories that will be coming out about all the, I could go to a hospital and talk about the number of victims who are coming in here. I'm not sure how illuminating or helpful that would necessarily be. But for purposes of our discussion today, interested in like what's working and why, and where is there who needs more support here. And as it happens, this dancer is actually part of this larger consortium of artists who are coming together, and then this government organization is funding. And then I can start stepping back and making it about something bigger that's working or that needs more funding or whatever. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying I would get clarity about what story you're telling, and then, there might be women who are just victims. I would like to try to find their agency and that of their children, and isn't it amazing, despite all these things that are going on here, look at her. And that's kind of my take on that. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, that was really helpful.
Yeah. And again, you can see how your questions are very general. And I think that's when we can start to fall into traps, because we're not talking about individuals. We're talking about women and, Bosnian women or, Congolese men. That you fall into these, how should we characterize them? Well, let's talk about this Congolese guy and what he's doing. So that's kind of, I would encourage people when they're having these ethical questions to break it down into real people and real issues that are happening. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes.
Somebody else
I wanted to
has,
just
yeah,
add
please.
from the point of view of the Peace NGO, right, that deals with this all the time and that gets the pressure from, a funder or a board member that thinks that the picture of the struggle is the one that's going to bring money in, right? Or the picture of, what tugs at the heartstring is going to bring more attention, which is probably in terms of which you're saying these are professors and they're giving advice, and how do you weigh it, right? So what is the intended goal? Probably the professor that's suggesting the traumatic picture has a particular goal to it, and vice versa. But I think what Amy's suggesting, there are two things that I take away, which is we need to strive to understand both and know where we're at. And finding the agency, finding the dignity takes a little longer. It's a harder job. So we have to, I think, compel ourselves to accept that it's more work to get the deeper story, or to show an image of maybe the horrible thing that's happened, but maybe we work with that person a little bit longer, or find a photo of something that was the good time, or the work that person actually does when there's not a war. And that gets me to this point of why we wanted to do this as part of this conference, which is the importance of communications inside of the work that we do in the peace building and democracy space, and that it's not an afterthought, and that it can't be something that gets reduced in budgets because that seems like something extra. I think that the storytelling is really at the heart of what we're doing, so we need to be thinking differently about the skills that we're investing in, the points of view that we are learning from, so that we can do this better. So it is a total struggle, and thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think and just one last point I think is talking about resiliency in people. I think for any of us, we can all think about the worst things that have happened to us, and we can picture a journalist coming in and doing a story about us and the hardships we've endured, which range the gamut, I am sure. And if somebody came in to do a story about that with me, I think about, would I want them to portray me as a victim? And I think on its face, looking at some things that happened to me in my life, you could do that. I don't, I would like to also show, what I've overcome. And I think it's kind of, and I do this all the time in my journalism. I've had so many ethical debates, it's a conversation for another time, where I have made decisions because I think to myself, if this were my father, would I want a journalist to come in and include these details about him? It would be a better story. It might be more compelling, but would it be ethical? And so I've left details out of stories. I've left entire scenes out of stories that I know would be compelling, but they would be inappropriate for my family. And that's the same standard I use for everybody I'm reporting on. And not to say that I know what it's like to be you. I'm not saying that. All I know, if something starts to smell a little bit like exploitative or wrong or a little unseemly, I leave it out. I don't need it. I've got plenty of good material. And I want to wake up every morning feeling good about myself and how I've portrayed people's struggles and victories. And so I think that's a great barometer to use. The same one that I'd want a journalist to use for me. Yes?
Yeah, so we have a great question from Zoom. So one thing I found crucial that was mentioned is post-publication follow-up. If someone, like I have and Ms. Otiende have, feels very exposed and perhaps further traumatized post-publication, what would you then do after that check-in? How would you help that individual?
So if I found out that somebody had felt kind of re-traumatized due to my reporting process or from the story that we put up, first of all, I think it's great to, it's learning like we all do when somebody points out the error of our ways, is to acknowledge that. And I think it would be excellent feedback to ask, what could I have done differently? What was the hardest part of this for you? Is there anything we can do to repair this? Is there more you want to say? Can we do a follow-up story? Do you want me to acknowledge something? I think to have a conversation to figure out what went wrong here and why. And then it would be really important, ideally, to reflect that back to your organization to say, hey, maybe have some kind of lunch where we talk about, I've heard back from somebody that I've interviewed and it hasn't gone very well for them. And I think we need to figure out if there's any remedies we can take, and I think it almost sounds a little bit of an aside, but there is something I do like to do at the end of interviews. I always try to say, is there anything else we haven't talked about that you would like to say? Because sometimes they might have reflections about what they've said or want to correct a little something or illuminate something. And I would say like 8 times out of 10, I get something really good from the person. It's been this thing on the back of their mind that they've been thinking about and haven't said. And I love to allow pauses in interviews. So sometimes I'll ask a question like that. Anything else you want to say that you didn't get a chance to say? Silence. Silence. Yeah, there is something. And then you get, and so that can also be, it's not going to be a solution to the question you just raised, but it does give your guest an opportunity to kind of correct the record or to just, feels like maybe I was going down this line of questioning and she wants to talk about something over here, which oftentimes will, oh yeah, tell me about that, so anyway, that's just another little small technique I like to use to make sure people feel fully heard and that they've been able to say everything they want to say. Did you have something?
I'm thinking of one, but
Oh, okay.
There was a hand over there and she had to walk out, so we'll have to find her question later.
I don't have a question. I have a potential solution, I guess.
Oh, good.
For some of these issues.
Great.
Something that I found really innovative that I'm Brian from Save the World, and when I came to Save the World, we do a lot of publications, research around very difficult subjects and conflict areas where it might not be good to photograph a Yemeni feminist activist and then put her face on front of your report.
Yes.
And so one of the tools, I guess, that our communications team has done and repeated in other contexts is commissioning artists, feminist artists in that country to produce artworks for our publications.
Nice.
And that's the way that you're able to still put a face to a story, but it's not necessarily endangering anyone because it's a fictional character or a person.
And do you compensate them for their art?
Absolutely.
Great. That's awesome. That's a great idea. Yeah.
Now you've given us all the secret.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, where can we do that?
Yeah, very good. I like that. Anyone else?
I'll ask you a question because I know that they asked you yesterday, and I thought it was a really interesting element. Some of the people, in our team were really asking about tactics. So there's the approaches and things that we need to be sensitive about, and then there's also like really specific things about the way you ask questions in your journalism. And I wanted to ask if you could share, with this group a little bit about, the importance of the eye contact and getting that tool that you're using to record away from, someone's focus so that they feel comfortable. All of those aspects of talking and communicating. I was looking to see if there were any more questions online as well, or comments. So please feel free to add any more questions, comments for those that are online. We've got about 3 minutes.
Great. Yeah, so this will be a little hands-on, practical. I was showing Rosalie yesterday. I've mostly done audio. I've done some television, but what I like to do when I'm interviewing somebody, and again, this is all in a cultural context. All of you know when you're working in different regions what's appropriate and what isn't, but I would not have my legs exposed in lots of places. But before radio, I need to get pretty close to people, and I always hold the mic. I don't hand it over to them. But it's a nice opportunity to get close to somebody. And a lot of times when I bring a microphone to people, they get a little anxious because they're not accustomed to that. And so I don't make a big deal of the microphone. I'm just making eye contact with you, and I want to talk to you. And I just put this here where you can't really see it too much. And we just start talking. If I go like, can I record you? Would that be all right? I have this microphone, and you're going to start to bristle. So the calmer that I am with whatever equipment I have, or if I have my notebook, just being if I'm comfortable, they tend to be comfortable. And then we just have our interview. Many of you may have to work with translators at times, and I have lots of thoughts about working with translators. One of which is I always bring my own translator. That's a budget issue, but if one can afford it, I don't rely on like government translators, for instance, or people who may have an agenda to interpret for me with filters of some kind or another. And I also look for a really excellent translator, because there's nothing worse than somebody giving you a long, colorful response, and then the translator says to you, yeah, they liked it. So I want somebody. And I will always ask the translator to speak in the first person, not say, she says she is having a difficult time finding food here. I have the translator, whether it's a man or gender doesn't matter. I will have the translator speak in the first person because I want that for my audio. But then if the translator's here, I will ignore the translator. And if you're speaking to me in a language I can't understand, I will keep listening to you, and I'm going to ask you a question. The translator's going to translate. I'm not going to look at this person, and you're going to start speaking to me in a language I don't understand. And we're going to be talking, even if we can't understand each other. And I can tell when you're getting emotional, when you're telling me something deep, as we've all experienced with language barriers. There's so much that's communicated anyway, and I want you to know I'm listening to you. And then the translator will speak, but I never do this. So what did she say about, and can you ask her what, I say, well, tell me more about that. And then what happened? So we're engaging, she's listening to me, and so those are just a few little tips that I use, but I try to make the translator not there. And I just think this kind of proximity, this is what I would do if I was speaking to a friend. And again, culturally, sometimes this kind of closeness might not be appropriate, whatever's culturally appropriate. But I think to have this kind of nice engagement, I try to not, even if I go to a CEO's office, I never sit on the other side of the desk. I say to this, person with the tie on, do you mind if I come around? I'm just going to come around the desk. I need to get close to you. And I just come right around his desk or her desk, and I sit here. And it's just a nice kind of way to make people feel, my job, my goal is to make people feel as comfortable as possible, and that this isn't an interview, this is just a conversation, So was that helpful? Yeah. Yeah, please.
Hi, sorry, I had to come in late. I'm Nick Zarowski. I'm a manager for policy and advocacy with AFP, shared office with Partners Global. So, friend with Partners. So there has been research that shows you tell a story about if you're telling a story about an individual and they're exceptional, right? They've gone through like an enormous challenge, overcome, you know, significant obstacles. It's important to tell that story. There can be a problem where people reading it think, well, that's great, but that person is 1 in a million. What does it matter to me in my situation? How do I have agency over my own situation? And so I'm curious what your thoughts are as to how we can attribute successful stories or stories of resilience to make them feel relatable, and so that people reading them feel agency over their own situations and just, wow, I'm so impressed by this one amazing person that I'll never, you know, live up to or match with. So sorry if that's long-winded.
Can you give, like, is there a little example that you can think of?
Well, the example, sorry. The example I always think of is like every USAID report, right? You know, a woman in Nigeria who had to overcome, you know, horrible climate change affecting her ability to gain income from, you know, her farming or agriculture source of, and it's because she was resilient and she, you know, pulled herself up by her bootstraps and she was just so incredible, and we just want to give a platform to people. It's like, okay, that's great. Well, I don't feel incredible because I'm going through enormous stress in my own situation, right? So
I'm meaning somebody else.
The
living in
person
Nigeria?
reading, yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
So how do we make people reading in conflict-affected and fragile contexts around the world feel like they have agency from the stories that we tell? So that's my question.
Yeah.
Good question, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the idea of agency is really interesting, and I remember I was talking about giving people agency at one presentation, and somebody pushed back against me and was like, well, everybody has agency and you're not giving them anything. And I was like, oh, okay, you're right. So I think, again, I can't say enough about specificity with a story. So if I were telling a story about a successful woman business owner in Nigeria who has overcome, you know, a lot, and relative to other people in her community, she's successful, and I would like to I'm doing this story because I'm going to be writing for an audience of her peers there in Nigeria, not for an international audience. It sounds like you're talking about how do I inspire and make this real to other people in her community or nation. I think it's about trying to unpack, why was she successful? You know, what did she do? And again, it's really getting that specificity. I always talk about, like, when I've taught journalism, you know, we can have this kind of wide angle lens, and like I said, you could go and report on the conflict in this region, and that's just a huge story, overwhelming, but keep digging down. So, you know, I would be very interested in hearing, you know, especially what stumbling blocks did she encounter? She inevitably, as many of us do on our road to success, we meet many, many roadblocks. How did she overcome them? Who did she find inspiring? Did she have a mentor? Did she get a little bit of investment money? You know, what did she tell herself when she was awake at night in debt and it looked like things weren't going to work out for her? What did she do? And see, like, I'm sure there's so many lessons that she could impart, but it's really about unpacking her success and finding that interesting thread as the person who's interviewing her, and, oh, tell me more about that. Oh, that's interesting. And then what did you do? And, you know, what would you say to other people who grew up in this village who would like to be like you are? Or what would you say to somebody who's got an idea for this in a different sector altogether? You know, so I think there are absolutely ways. And that's the beauty of, like, well, like, if you think of, like, you know, the New Yorker magazine, or, you know, well-written stories. I often think I'm about to read about something I don't think I have any interest in, because it's about, you know, I don't know, construction or something I know nothing about.
The New Yorker is very good at that.
What's that?
The New Yorker is very good
Exactly.
at that. Yeah.
Well, there you go. So, you know, I think we can glean lessons from all kinds of people, and make it accessible and kind of unpack their success in ways that, you know, but I think to just kind of tell the story of all her successes, which a lot of those stories are, wow, she seems amazing, it all just fell together for her. I doubt it. You know, I think, you know, to really kind of dig into what her process was, and could be helpful, and, you know, very helpful for other people that you're trying to say, this could also be you, you know?
I just want to add, like, I think in our space, the problem, one of the challenges is when we're writing these things, we're looking for the what, and then a really quick sentence, and I'm not saying you do this, but I mean in this, really quick sentence to say, like, what was the intervention, as if it's one thing that made the change happen, and then, you know, pointing at this, like, improvement, whatever it might have been. And so the story that Amy's talking about just is completely, it's missing from a lot of the way we do this type of storytelling, which is something that I would call reporting. You know, it's about reporting back to our funders, our whatever, average community, and, you know, largely, yeah, it's the donors that we're reporting back to. So getting out of this process of reporting and then getting into the thought of storytelling is a shift in a mindset in our space. And you reminded me, and I won't, you know, speak long on this, but there was a situation where I was working on a project in the Middle East, and it was a taboo subject, so it was breast cancer awareness in the Middle East, and it wasn't being talked about very much. So we had a lot of the ethical issues coming up because there were some women who really wanted to bring it forward. And, you know, when they did, you know, it was difficult to decide what to show as an image, etc. But the point being here that it was not focusing so much, I mean, and that's a health issue, but it was about their advocacy, right? So like that they took a risk, they advocated, you know, they may have done so in a public space. And we knew that when we were writing about these things, even if we were trying to protect the space it was going to be shared in, we couldn't control it. But what that did was, at the end, we would say, it was like a little section that we put in for the reader. You know, does, you know, Salma's story speak to you in any way? Have you encountered this kind of a situation? Do you know where to turn? And then we'd provide a resource. So it's sort of, I mean, that might not be the best example, but sometimes with the storytelling, we would add a contextual piece that allows people to do something with that information. Again, I know that it's a health advocacy issue, which is different, but we had found it useful to not to give agency, but then to provide some resources if a person was willing to sort of access their agency despite what they might face. So that's one suggestion, again, for our kind of reporting that we do in a project sense. Any other comments or feedback? I know that we're over time, and
Bridget.
Yeah.
Well, I have a little question for you, Rosalie, with your strategic communications background. So we've been talking a lot, obviously, the ethics of reporting, making sure everyone is safe, comfortable, do no harm. But when you're, you know, a peace building professional, you're going to visit your counterparts who are working. How can you make sure that while you're following these best practices, you get the information you need to tell a compelling story? Like, what are your best practices from that strategic communications viewpoint?
I mean, for me, the most important thing that comes to mind is, like, every single time, and you know this because I probably asked you this question, but to me it's all about, it sounds very crass, but I would just say, like, so what? What is the impact of this information that I've learned? What would we do differently? How can we improve a process? I would always just say, okay, we have something that seems really well packaged and it feels complete, but, you know, it's the why, I think, in the beginning of your, so it's the why. I think that's the connection for me in the beginning of thinking about doing a story. We have to ask why we're doing it. And I guess the litmus test at the end of a visit would always be like, so what, Rosalie? Why, you know, why did we put this time in? And if part of that so what feels exploitative, you know, or if there's a confusion in there, like I don't really have a quick answer, then I feel like it wasn't something to use. I don't know if that gets at your question.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of approaching people, and if there's somebody that's willing to speak, I think almost at all times, if you're respectful and you follow these kind of tools, I think the do no harm principles that we've been talking about, you know, we can take the steps to make sure that we have consent in the beginning, at the end, talk to our colleagues, you know, that when we, you know, bounce in and bounce out and we leave and there's still colleagues on the ground, they sometimes, right, they might hear that somebody was actually a little uncomfortable, didn't want to tell you. And so that's the other thing that I would do is always have after action reviews with those that are closest to it, and just ask the question directly. How do you think that went? You know, was anybody in there uncomfortable? Do you think that this could, you know, actually asking those questions, do you think that this could, you know, cause any kind of negative impact? Why? All right, think about it more. I mean, we do these after actions way too late. So I think it would be putting that in earlier. What about you?
Yeah, I think for me is just kind of really thinking hard about what a successful story means. And I think in the fundraising space, which many of us are in, and it's why we're telling stories, is a successful story one that raises a lot of money? Possibly. But if it raised a lot of money off exploiting somebody, I would call that's not a successful story. And like I said, you know, with the stories that I've told, I've sometimes left out some really compelling scenes. And that's a successful story to me. And maybe my fellow journalists would have like led with that stuff. It's like really compelling. I think sometimes things happen that are private, like I happen to be there for, and it just feels a little bit sacred to me. And so that stays with me. And that's a successful story to me. And that's what I build a successful career on, is ethics. And so for me, I think I can do ethical storytelling that's also successful. And that's to my own barometer. And another journalist might have his or her own, or their own barometer. But I think there's absolutely ways to incorporate ethics and to have really strong, compelling stories that raise money, but that we can all feel good about, and the people that we've talked about can feel good about too. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, AFP. Where are you guys? Yes, busy week, and to everybody.
Yes, thank you.
And thanks